Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am talking with Antone Martinho-Truswell. Antone is the Dean and Head of House of the Graduate House at St. Paul's College at the University of Sydney. He's also a Research Associate at the Department of Zoology at the University of Oxford, where he continues to study learning and cognition in birds, and more broadly in animal minds, and how applications of animal cognition research can help us understand artificial intelligence. He is the author of the book, The Parrot in the Mirror, How Evolving to Be Like Birds Made Us Human, which is a fantastic book. We start by talking about the importance of the phylogenetic tree. We talk about ways in which warm-bloodedness, vision, and sleep are connected with humans and birds. We spend some time talking about bird brains and how birds' brains give them their ability for flight and longevity, and how while bird brains are small in size, they have very densely packed neurons in the small space. And so he kind of dispels the misnomer that the bird brain is kind of somehow making one less intelligent. We talk about animal intelligence and what that means. We talk about corvids and their use of tools. We talk about the different bird categories. We talk about songbirds, parrots, and hummingbirds. We talk about how birds communicate, and as well as talking about bird song. And then we talk about the distinct features of parrots themselves and the parallel that he makes with humans and how we can understand some of the aspects of humans. I have to say this was such a fun conversation. I've had a few guests now where we've talked about birds. I've had various ornithologists and biologists, and it's always interesting to hear each person's work in a very specific aspect of their field, and to hear what they're researching on about birds, and just how much is illuminated from understanding birds and how we can understand other types of animals. He's absolutely fantastic in the conversation. I really enjoyed our conversation. His book is very accessible, very easy to read, and I found myself enjoying it quite a lot. And so now I bring you Antone Martinho-Truswell. I'm here with Antone Martinho-Truswell. Antone, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm very excited to talk with you about your book.
No, thank you very much. It's very, very nice to be here.
Yeah. So tell listeners who you are, what you do, what you study, and all the relevant details.
So I'm Antone Martinho-Truswell. I am an evolutionary biologist and an animal behavior researcher. And I'm also Dean of Graduate House at St. Paul's College in Sydney. My research has looked a lot into how animals perceive the world around them and how they organize that information for later use. This is something we humans do really easily. We have all sorts of categories in our heads to put things into. We understand our world by drawing connections between the different things that we know. And so my research looks into sort of how animals do that as well. And in the scope of that research, I also developed the idea that turned into this book, which was looking into the deep similarities between the behaviors of humans and of birds, and particularly certain species of birds like corvids, passerines, and parrots. That's not a biological similarity. It's not doesn't come about because of relatedness. It comes about because of similar evolutionary pressures that result in similar behaviors. So this was something that interested me for a while from a research perspective, and then I decided to write this book for the general public as a sort of an object lesson in evolutionary biology through the lens of why it is that we share so much with birds.
Yeah. No, you do an absolute wonderful job of it. The book is called The Parrot in the Mirror, and it's really wonderful. It's well written, very accessible for the general public. It's not a very long book, which many people will find that appealing as well.
Yeah,
so
it's slim volume.
yeah, and it's got a beautiful cover. It's just great. It's just a great book, and I think a lot of people can get a lot out of it. So I'm excited to talk to you.
Thanks, man. I can't take credit for the cover, but I am extremely grateful to the publishers for the cover, because I think that it was going to help the book to do well. They've really
absolutely. Nice it's an eye catcher. I remember seeing it, I came across it and I said, oh my, it's quite gorgeous. So it's a very nice cover too. It's not just about the cover, the content's fabulous as well, but both things together are great. So I guess you kind of mentioned already about kind of why you wrote the book. And so I guess I want to just jump right in. In the beginning, you talk about these kinds of ways in which we understand structures of birds and of mammals, and you talk about the phylogenetic tree and why that's important. So just tell us about the phylogenetic tree in birds and in mammals, and I guess where humans fit there as well, as we're connected as vertebrates.
Yes. So the first chapter of the book really outlines the relatedness or lack thereof between mammals and birds, and as the whole point of the book is that I'm looking at two groups of animals who I contend are not very closely related, but end up with similar behaviors. I have to first sort of stand up that point that we aren't that closely related. And that means explaining the sort of tree of life, at least of the animal kingdom, to the reader. And the first chapter of the book spends a bit of time on that. And that also lays out where birds and mammals and ultimately humans come from in terms of their evolutionary background and the sort of onboard biological equipment they come with. The phylogenetic tree is a way of looking at the relatedness of life. So you've probably seen them if you've ever seen a sort of tree of life diagram, whether that's the famous one from Darwin's notebooks or a simplified version in a textbook or something like that. But the way that they work is that they show visually how different groups of animals have diverged from each other, how far back you need to go, either in time or relative to other groups of animals before you find a common ancestor. So all of evolution is basically the principle of different species diverging from the same common ancestor. And ultimately, it's a little bit controversial whether there was one origin of life on Earth or multiple in a similar time period, but ultimately working back all living animals to a single common ancestor that will have emerged quite a long time ago. I think the origin of animals is, let me think here. The origin of animals is slightly less than 1 billion years ago. There's about 3.5 billion years of non-animal life on Earth, of microbes of one kind or another. And then you have the emergence of animals, and then most animals are invertebrates. So the overwhelming majority of groups and of individual species are invertebrates. Everything from your jellyfish and sponges at the very simple end up to things like arthropods, like bees or starfishes, which are echinoderms at the top end. And echinoderms are our closest invertebrate relatives. And then we have the emergence of the vertebrates, and that includes most of the animals that we first come to mind when we think about the animal kingdom: mammals, reptiles, birds, amphibians, and fish. And as it happens, at the very top of the tree, closest together from the perspective of the whole tree of life, are the birds, the reptiles, and the mammals. So you think of them from that sort of global perspective as being quite closely related. But actually, to find the common ancestor of all three of those groups, you have to go back 300 million years. And you go back to an animal that did not look much like either. You go back to an animal that was cold-blooded, an animal that looked basically reptilian, and we have emerging from it two groups, the reptiles and the mammals. And then we have emerging from the reptiles, and specifically from the dinosaurs, we have the birds. So the birds are as distantly related to us as, say, a turtle or anything else reptilian. You have to go back to that same convergent point to get to any of them. Right. And you sort of go down the tree from humans through apes, through mammals, to that common ancestor, and then back up through early reptiles, dinosaurs, and back up to birds. And no matter where you're going on the reptile side, it's sort of similarly distant, which is to say quite distant. So we lay out at the beginning that this method of looking at the relatedness of life shows us how much exists between mammals, including ourselves, and birds, and sort of lays out this point that whatever similarities we have with birds are not because we shared them all the way back then. They aren't inherited similarities. We don't. It's not the same as having the same hair color as your brother, where you have the same hair color as your brother because your father had that hair color.
Right.
The differences, the similarities that exist between us occurred independently and occurred because of evolutionary pressure since we diverged, not because they were shared traits when we diverged.
Yeah, that's a great way of kind of outlining it. One of the things you discuss is that there's a few things that make it similar. So while there's a large gap between birds and humans, there are some things that have independently evolved, which are probably some features of convergent evolution, I would imagine. But you talk about warm-bloodedness as a way that connects us with birds, that there's some, even in terms of vision, there's some similarities between birds and humans, and also sleeping patterns. So maybe just on these kind of three prongs of sorts, the warm-bloodedness, the vision, and the sleeping, how are those elements or features connecting humans with birds, or where is the crossover there?
So warm-bloodedness is a very interesting one, and it's something that is only shared by mammals and birds, but it's also one of the more trivial in that the reason why a group of species might evolve to become warm-blooded is pretty broad. In the main advantage that you have in being warm-blooded is that you can live pretty much anywhere. You can evolve to live pretty much anywhere. So a cold-blooded species is limited in its behavior by maintaining its body temperature. And all of the processes that happen in an animal body are regulated by temperature. So a lot of chemical processes, whether that's enzyme function or even just simple chemical reactions that happen in solution, will happen faster in a warmer environment and slower in a colder environment. And so with cold-blooded reptiles, for example, you have the reality that a lot of their body systems slow down when it's cold and heat up and speed up when it's warm. So that puts a restriction on their behavior. They have to move around and physically maintain their body temperature through movement and through changing their location if they need a process to run faster or slower, or if they need to heat up their body or cool it down. Being warm-blooded simply offers you the freedom that you generate your own body heat through respiration is essentially very slow combustion of carbon in your body. So you can generate your own body heat, and that means that your internal chemistry is much more self-regulated. You maintain an environment that is ideal for those chemical reactions that support the body's function to keep happening. And we think that emerged in the dinosaurs on the bird side and in early mammals on the mammal side. But critically, their shared ancestor was not warm-blooded. So while oftentimes evolutionary biologists would point to two groups of animals and say these two groups share some traits, it's most likely that it was present in their shared ancestor and that they've both inherited it. We actually know that in this case, it has emerged twice. Warm-bloodedness has evolved separately 2 different times, once in the ancestor of mammals and once in the ancestor of dinosaurs and birds. The vision and the sleeping cycle, interestingly, go together. So it is the case that most mammals are nocturnal. They're awake at night, they sleep during the day. Now, people sometimes find it a little hard to believe because they think of a lot of the big mammals that we interact with, like dogs and horses and zoo animals, elephants and things like that, as being awake during the day when we interact with them. And it's true that large mammals often are diurnal. They're awake during the day. But the overwhelming majority of mammals look much more like a rat or a mole than they do like a lion or an elephant. Lions and elephants are in our zoos and exciting to us precisely because they're unusual. The vast majority of mammals are these little diggy, creepy, crawly, fuzzy things that sort of run around in the dark. And part of the reason for that is an evolutionary bottleneck that happened back when the dinosaurs were still alive, which is that when you have large, mainly diurnal dinosaurs roaming around the earth, filling all of the ecological niches for large, dominant animals, there's not really much room for a big dominant mammal to emerge. So the early mammals that evolved during that time were mainly keeping out of the way of dinosaurs and scurrying between their toes in the dark, staying away from the daytime that was dominated by these giant reptiles. So from there, we have that when the dinosaurs are wiped out by the impact, the mammals come from a starting point of being nocturnal and need to evolve to be diurnal to the extent that they're going to be. The birds, meanwhile, start as dinosaurs, so they start diurnal already. And it's not until later on in mammal evolution that we start to get more large diurnal mammals to fill those empty niches left by dinosaurs and other large extinct animals at that point. With humans, we eventually do become diurnal, and like other large dominant mammals, we are diurnal. And then that pushes a change in our vision. So if you're a nocturnal mammal, you do not need very sophisticated color vision, because in the dark, you mainly can't see color. You need clear definition in your mainly sort of black and white vision. And if you pay attention to our own vision when it's dark, we don't see color very well in the dark. We can see the definition and shapes of things okay, but it becomes harder and harder to distinguish color. When you're diurnal, color becomes much more useful to you. And so the overwhelming majority of mammals only have two types of color sensors. And this is what we mean when we say that dogs are colorblind. If you've ever thrown your dog a red toy on a green lawn, they often have a hard time finding it, because they are what we humans would call red-green colorblind. They have blue and they have yellow vision. And that gives them some gradient between those two, but they have a hard time seeing red as distinct from greenish bluish. And that's true of pretty much all mammals except primates, ourselves and the other apes and monkeys. Birds are actually tetrachromats. So in addition to the three color sensing cones that we have, they have a fourth that has some ultraviolet sense. For any animal that's awake during the day, being able to distinguish color becomes much more important and much more useful. And so we see here an evolutionary pressure pushing us away from a mammal behavior towards a bird behavior as we become diurnal and more reliant on vision. And humans are much more reliant on vision than most mammals. We know this. One of the common things that people know about their own dogs is that their smell and hearing is better than ours, but their vision is not as good. And that's pretty common across the mammal world. It's a very primate thing to be reliant on vision and to be learning most of what you know about the world from vision. For birds, they are hugely reliant on vision. Their sense of smell is not nearly as good as most mammals. Some of them have very good sense of hearing, like owls, which not coincidentally are awake mainly at night. But most birds really do focus mainly on vision for their understanding of the world around them. And this is a unity that we've seen come in primates and in birds that is not at all something that was shared in the evolutionary history of these groups.
Yeah, it's really fascinating how there's distinct differences, but there's a lot of overlap as well, which is kind of how you make it throughout the book. And then you really kind of punch home that point towards the end. One of the things that you kind of take issue with in the beginning of the book is this idea of having a bird brain, which other folks have also had some issue with that kind of colloquial way of saying things. So obviously there's some interesting things about human brains and how it's analogous to flight in birds. So maybe just tell us first the key element of flight that has helped birds survive and live long, and how the idea of movement helps for their longevity. And then you can tell us how flight in birds is kind of somewhat similar to how our human brains are kind of distributed or organized or whatever, and shows the similarities.
Sure. So you've already picked on one of the themes that runs through this book, which is that all of these different behaviors and traits are really entangled with each other. So brain size and ability is entangled with flight for some reason. And part of what I try to do in this is teach people to think a bit like an evolutionary biologist and see why those two are intimately connected. Birds fly is this very simple statement that seems like a sort of a schoolyard idea of what do we know about birds? They fly. But it's so important to understanding why birds are the way they are. Partly because it's so rare. The vast majority of things do not fly. And yet this whole group of animals that we usually think of as a coherent group, the birds, overwhelmingly they fly. And to the extent that there are exceptions, they are really exceptions. They are things like ostriches and other ratites that are huge and have specifically evolved for a running focus. And then there are some island-dwelling birds that have lost their ability to fly in pursuit of greater size, like the kakapo, which is a flightless parrot in New Zealand and the world's largest parrot, heaviest parrot, I should say.
And was it what do they call it? The cassowary? Is this wrong? Am I saying this wrong?
The cassowary is a ratite. That's in Australia, and then the kiwi is in New Zealand and is also a ratite. It's the smallest. It's the smallest ratite. So the ratites, the ostrich, the emu, the cassowary, the rhea, and the kiwi are this one small offshoot of birds. They're one of the earliest offshoots of birds, and they don't fly. But pretty much all other birds, unless they have specifically lost the ability to fly, and it's really fundamental to how they work biologically. And this gets into one of the more complex ideas that I try to introduce in the book, which is why some animals live longer than other animals. And it's a tricky question. So on the one hand, it is the case that larger animals tend to live longer than smaller animals. And that usually works as long as you're looking at animals that are pretty similar to each other. But when you start to look across biological groups, say from birds to mammals, that correlation doesn't quite work as well anymore, because you run into things like a small mouse might live 2, 3, 4 years, even if you look after it really carefully. A well taken care of budgie or parrotlet can easily get to 20 or more. So there's a sort of an order of magnitude difference in longevity between these similarly sized animals. And what you have to take into account is breeding and the opportunity to breed. Evolution works on your opportunity to breed. So if there is something that gives you an opportunity to spread your genes more, then natural selection will favor that, because you will spread your genes more, and then there will be more of those genes that gave you that opportunity out in the world. It's not an active process, it's a passive process, but the very nature of it is that if you breed more, then the genes that helped you breed more will be a larger proportion of the next generation, and so will spread. If you are a mouse and living in a natural environment where you live on the ground, you're small, and you're capable of reproducing quickly, it is very likely in any given year or breeding season that it will be your last, because the risks to your life in the normal natural world are fairly great. Cats, owls, being stepped on, there's so many things that can cause the life of a mouse to end quickly and suddenly, that in any given breeding season, there's a pretty good chance you won't make it to the next one. So your best strategy for producing the most copies of your genes in the world is to have a lot of young, as many young as you can in a given breeding season, get them out and on their own as quickly as possible, and hope that they survive and that there are enough of them that your genes survive indefinitely into the future. There's not much sense in putting any survival stock into being able to reproduce 2 years down the road. That also means that there's not much evolutionary pressure to make your body last that long. Lives grow longer only when there's an evolutionary reason for them to grow longer, i.e. when the body develops capabilities of repairing itself and of looking after itself and of keeping the whole machine going. Keeping a living body continuing to function is an extremely complex process that has been shaped by evolution, and in order to keep it going longer and longer, you have more and more things that can go wrong. So you need more and more evolutionary pressure to develop body systems that will keep you alive. On the other hand, if you're a very small bird, you can fly. And so you can fly away from most sources of danger. Your chances of being killed in any given year are smaller than if you can't fly, precisely because of this evolutionary silver bullet that is being able to fly up in a third dimension away from potential predators. So for a small bird, even though you're small and maybe physically quite vulnerable, as long as you can still fly, the chances of you being alive to reproduce again next year and in 5 years and in 10 years are pretty good. So there's evolutionary pressure to also develop the internal mechanisms that keep your body functioning and prevent you from getting cancer or wearing out or losing muscle elasticity or whatever it is that causes aging in other animals to happen earlier. So aging is basically just degeneration. And is some people who are in the sort of anti-aging research community think of it as a degenerative disease, something a bit like Huntington's that comes on when you're older and causes your body to fall apart. And that normal aging is like that. And any evolutionary pressure that causes you to push off that process will cause you to live longer. If you can fly, that comes with innate evolutionary pressure to stay alive because you have another pretty good opportunity at reproducing. And if you live a long time and so reproduce 10 times instead of 5, then there are now twice as many of your genes in the next generation as there would have been otherwise. So that gene for living long is doing well in the reproductive market. Right. All of this then loops back to brains, because if you're going to live a long time, it's valuable to be able to learn. If you're only going to live for 1 or 2 years, then learning to adapt to a changing environment with a big brain that is expensive and resource intensive to produce and to maintain doesn't have the same advantage than if you have 30 years to learn and adapt. So we tend to see big brains in long-living organisms, and exceptions like the octopus.
I was just thinking about the octopus.
Quite rare and quite unusual.
Right.
If to take some cataclysm changes your environment, if you're a long-living organism, you need to be able to adapt around that, or you are sacrificing all of that long life of reproductive potential ahead of you. So having a high level of intelligence that allows you to come up with new solutions is very useful. Yeah. If you were going to die at the end of the year anyway, it hardly matters. There's very little pressure to develop this strong computational and analytical power because you're never going to get the chance to use it. Exceptions like the octopus often come about from unusual evolutionary situations. So in the case of the octopus, we have a really strong pressure to become more intelligent by the emergence of bony fish. What we think happened is that with the emergence of fast swimming, highly capable hunters in the bony fish, the octopus emerges from previous cephalopods that still had a shell, and starts to become this more wily predator and good at camouflage and good at sort of sneaking about.
So the jet propulsion that it has as well is able to,
and becomes more intelligent to sort of compete with these emerging fast swimming hunting bony fish. But at that point emerges from a lineage that has already doubled down on live fast, die young. So it's coming from an invertebrate lineage where every element of their biology says you grow up, you feed as much as you can, you have thousands upon thousands of eggs to try to beat the evolutionary odds, you give every bit of your life to them, starve yourself to death looking after them, they hatch and they're on their own, and you try to win the evolutionary game by sheer force of numbers. If you already have all of that on board programming for this live fast, die young method of reproducing, then when you become intelligent for an extrinsic reason, like competing with the bony fish, there isn't the pressure to get rid of all of that evolutionary structure that says you live fast and die young. Not least because making the evolutionary jump from dying after you breed once, where obviously there is some sort of hormonal or physiological switch that once they breed, senescence starts and can't be stopped, overcoming that evolutionarily is a really big jump in genetics. There's a lot of things that need to change. And if it's not failing, i.e. if it's working pretty well to breed that way, as it is for the octopodes, there's not a lot of pressure to change it. So they've sort of found themselves in an evolutionary cul-de-sac of being quite intelligent, but without really enough pressure to move them towards living a long time, because it wouldn't really change their success in the reproductive space.
So I'm glad you brought up the octopus, because as you were saying, I was like, well, what about the octopus? I mean, they only live like 2-3 years and they're, super intelligent. So I'm glad you highlighted kind of that footnote here. In terms of the flight though, right? So you've gone on about the brains of the birds, which is super important. But so obviously they have to develop ways in which they need to survive and develop ways of, problem solving, and we'll get to intelligence in a minute. But what is the aspect of flight aside from they can fly away from predators or, whatever? What was the instrumental piece about flight for birds?
So, I mean, that's where it begins. And we see that then leads to a long life. A long life means that having a big brain is useful. But also with flight, we have an effect on the structure of their brain. And this is true of everything to do with bird physiology, is that if you're going to fly, you need to make some pretty serious modifications to the physical structure of the animal in order to do that.
Yeah.
One of the ones that a lot of people are familiar with is that birds have hollow bones. They're very lightweight, and very fragile bones. And we do tend to know that birds are quite fragile animals if you do get hold of one. So they have sacrificed a lot of physical robustness in order to have this escape mechanism and huge improvement to their mobility. And it's also true of their brains. So I think the phrase bird brain as an insult emerged from the fact that if you dissect a bird, or if you have a farm animal or something like that, and you look at its head and you look at its brain, birds do not have very large physical brains, and they don't have very large heads either. They seem to have this small, people talk about having a brain the size of a peanut or something like that, which is true of some small birds. And so they think, well, a very small brain means that they can't have much computing power, because humans have a very big brain in the scheme of mammals. And that's related to the fact that we are the most intelligent animals on Earth. What's actually going on there is something much more profound, which is that in order to achieve liftoff, one of the things that birds have had to do is to shrink the size of their brain cells. They have some of the smallest neurons in the animal kingdom that take up much less room per cell. So, a bit like the race to make smaller and smaller microprocessors in computers, they have made smaller and smaller componentry for their biological computer. And what's even more interesting about that is that because nerve cells are cells that have to be developed by your genetics. When the body is developing, they are produced as a result of the instructions that are in the animal's DNA. A smaller nerve cell has a smaller nucleus, which means it can contain less DNA than a large neuron. And that means that they've actually had to shrink their genome size to sort of compress the file size of their species in order to fit it in a smaller nucleus that fits in a smaller nerve cell, so that they can have small enough nerve cells to have a very powerful brain in a very small space. So we see a huge prioritization of brain power in birds, which shouldn't be surprising. They can fly. That's a big processing task that has to be done in order to keep an animal in the air. And we know from bird behavior that they can do all sorts of complicated things. We know that parrots can learn to talk, and we know that lots of hunting birds are engaging in really complicated behaviors in order to carry out their hunting. And we know that their reproductive behaviors and displays and songs, we know intrinsically how complicated bird behavior is. We should know that their brain is doing quite a lot. So the fact that they have small brains is actually a very impressive case of strong prioritization of brain power into this very compact space, so that they can keep their body light and keep themselves in the air. And as a result, you compare similar physical size brains between mammals and birds. The birds have much higher neuron counts in that same space. And something like a macaw can have as many as 3 billion neurons in its brain, which is only about an order of magnitude less than ourselves, and way more than much larger mammals. They've compacted a huge amount of nerve cells into that space, because macaws are incredibly intelligent animals. They rival most primates, and they're doing it with a smaller body and a smaller head.
Yeah, I remember reading this in the book, and it was just kind of jumped off the page for me. It's like, wow. I mean, maybe it kind of intuitively makes sense, but it's just one of those things. So the way you spell it out is fascinating. It's like, everything's just kind of, densely packed for them to maintain, obviously, flight and things like that, but also to be very intelligent, which is really incredible. If you go to a park, or you're at a lake or a pond and you see birds hopping around, or you're in a city, it's aside from the aspect that they're dinosaurs, the other aspect is that they have this high intelligence in such a very small space, which is just really, really incredible. So I want to ask you about intelligence, but go ahead.
Yeah, well, if I may, I think one of the great signs of their intelligence, we think of a lot of birds as being fairly pedestrian because we see them so often. And I make this point in the book that we see probably more pigeons than we do rats, which would probably be the most common mammal of similar size in our cities and where humans live. And that's because the pigeons are diurnal. They're out during the day. They can fly away, so they're not nearly as afraid of us, and they're willing to go about their business in front of us, whereas rats will scurry away. We can see these things interlocking, and a big theme in the book is how all of these behaviors interlock. The very fact that so many birds are so successful at living in our cities, which we have hugely changed from their natural environment, doesn't make them pedestrian. It speaks to how very intelligent and capable they are, that they have adapted to this very strange, different environment from their natural environment. And I think when you go to the park, the very fact that the birds are there and still doing their thing is a sign of their intelligence and a sign of their adaptive capability. And the other point that I was going to make is that, you look at a human with a big brain and a very small body for the size of our brain and for the length of time that we live. And that really starts to look more at home with what we see in the birds. Anything with our size brain and our longevity on the mammal side is gigantic. They're whales and they're elephants and things like that. The animals that are a similar weight to us don't live half what we live at our best. And they don't have nearly the size and capability of brain that we do. So we on a sort of physical scale, we also sort of fit in with the birds on that front.
Yeah, that's actually a really, really good comparison point. I want to ask briefly about intelligence. So obviously intelligence I think in humans and I think in non-human animals is obviously, contended and, controversial in some aspects. People will have different definitions of intelligence and things like that. But I guess, how do you define it, intelligence, and how is it different from just, say, well-adaptive behavior? So some people will, question, is an octopus really intelligent, or are they just really good at, learning, right? Which is a type of intelligence, but not in the way that we see with humans. Are they conscious, in the way that we are? Maybe not. Sometimes there's just this kind of repetition that goes on, right? And it's not necessarily that you're, crystallizing information that you're receiving. Jury's still out on that with various octopuses. But how do you define intelligence as opposed to just, an adaptive behavior? And what can you tell us about the primates with feathers, the corvids, the crows and the ravens, and the macaws you mentioned? What can you tell us about their intelligence and their ability to use tools and memory and having some type of navigation system? And it's very fascinating. What can you tell us about that?
So, I have a little bit of a go at defining intelligence in the book. Partly that comes from my experience teaching animal behavior, and also from my experience talking to scientifically engaged and interested people who know a bit about the natural world, but don't necessarily think very much about the formal study of animal behavior. It is quite right that our school systems and television programs and the general cultural conversation about animals has stressed for years how interesting and wonderful it is that there are all of these diverse behaviors and that animal behaviors are so well tuned to their environment and they do just the right thing and maintain their survival through these often complicated and unlikely behaviors that keep them alive. And we have been taught to take great wonder at the natural world and be fascinated by it. And that's then led to something sort of frustratingly happens when we then try to teach animal behavior and animal intelligence to students, which is this idea of confusing intelligence with well-adaptedness. That doing a behavior that seems perfectly suited to your environment is intelligence, as opposed to being well-adaptedness. Right. And that leads to problems like, and the example that I give in the book is bud break in grapevines, which is that grapevines go dormant in the winter, and then when the spring happens and the weather starts to warm up and the water content of the soil is right and the temperature is right, the dormant buds break open and the new leaves start to grow out from those dormant buds. And that is a chemical process that happens because of the interaction of the heat of the surrounding air and the water content of the soil and roots and pressure and things like that. And that causes the buds to break and then they can start growing again. There's obviously no intelligence happening here, right, because there's no brain to speak of. It's a chemical process. One thing leads to another. It's like letting the air out of a balloon. The pressure is there. And so the balloon will go squirting around the room because the pressure is coming out. It's mechanic. Bud break is fundamentally mechanic. But I will talk to students and have them say, well, that's sort of intelligent in its own way, because if it broke too early, the plant would die because it would be too cold. If it broke too late, it's not maximizing its reproduction. It's very well adapted. It happens at the right moment because it needs to for evolutionary reasons. But there's no intelligence making it happen. It is happening mechanically. It's happening because the evolution has shaped the physical properties of the bud to not break until the pressure is just right. Intelligence is about creating a new behavior within your own lifetime. So you, as an organism, you come with an inbuilt set of physical structures and behaviors with those physical structures that are programmed by your DNA as the things that your species does. If you are then able to collect information about the world and create a new behavior that did not come with your onboard programming, shall we call it, that's intelligent. That is making a conclusion about the world and changing your behavior as a result of it, using inbuilt analytical power, but not using inbuilt behaviors. And so a lot of things that animals do that are quite complex, like migration at the right time of year, or like their, if they have a reproductive dance, or, a number of birds will have a series of displays that they do for reproduction. Those tend to be stereotyped across the whole species. They come as onboard programming of this is what you do when it's time to breed. This is what you do when spring comes. They are not a new behavior that the animal is inventing, thinking, well, my potential mate is really going to like this because it's brand new. There are some birds that do that. There are species where creativity in the breeding dance is a benefit. But there are lots of species where the breeding dance is always the same, and they're not making that up to try to appeal to her. They're doing it because it's what they need to do in order to breed. So when we test animal intelligence, we have to try to give them something that they haven't confronted before. And to take the example that people love, and it's one of my favorite examples as well, New Caledonian Crows, who are a type of corvid. Corvids, as you said, are the primates with feathers. They're a very intelligent group of animals. They're a very flexible group of birds. And a lot like primates, they don't have any really extreme physical features. They have a normal pointy beak. They've got a pretty normal sized body. They don't have any big claws. They're a flying bird-shaped bird that lives like a bird. They're a very sort of bog standard physical model. But they have really, really sophisticated intelligence to give them that flexibility. The New Caledonian Crow is one species of crow that uses tools as part of its natural behavior. They use little sticks or strips of pandanus leaf to go into the holes that are burrowed by grubs in trees to pull them out and eat them, because very, very high source of protein, very, very nourishing things. There's a strong evolutionary pressure to be able to get those grubs out of those holes. If you're a crow, you don't have a big parrot beak that can just crunch through the trunk of a tree. So in order to get the grub out of the tree, you need to use a tool to do it. And this seems to be an instinctual behavior. They come with the ability to use tools baked into their genetics, because the juveniles will start using tools for everything. They'll start playing about with little sticks and holding them in their beak and getting used to doing this right from a young age. And they'll also use tools to do things that don't require a tool. So they're not concluding that this problem needs a tool, so I'm going to go and get one to do it. Oftentimes, if there's just something that they're a little bit suspicious of that's out in the open and that they don't need a tool to get at, they'll pick up a tool and use one to sort of poke it and investigate it from a safe distance. It's absolutely standard behavior for them. So the fact that they use tools is not what makes them intelligent, but it is what makes them very interesting. If we then take them and put them in an environment where they are using different tools from what they've had before, or tools that they've never seen before, like a hook, and the famous experiment was when one of them created a hook, bent a piece of wire into a hook in order to reach down into a vertical tube and pull out food. That's the intelligence coming in. There's no aluminium wire in New Caledonia. There are no tiny buckets with vertical handles to be hooked by said aluminium wire. There's a totally non-natural environment. They're taking advantage of an ability that they have, which is a natural predisposition to use tools, but they're drawing a conclusion about the physical environment that they're in, and that piece of food needs a tool that is not here. I'm going to make one. That's intelligence. That's that flexibility. It's the creation of a new solution within the lifetime of the animal. And we see that again and again, especially in corvids and in parrots. They seem to have a boundless ability to invent new solutions to problems.
Yeah, I like your definition. I think you give that definition in the book too, because that's typically what many people in my field, so in psychology or people that are clinicians, they will use, people that study and do intelligence studies will use a very similar definition. There's a series in humans. You can think of it as based on many different things, genetics being one of them, that we have a kind of program that sets things, in utero. And then once you're born, you have interactions with the environment, and there's a lot of admixture that will happen. But intelligence is always, how do you solve a novel problem in different ways? And so it's one of those things where you have this type of, cognitive flexibility, et cetera. And obviously there's different layers and dimensions to intelligence. And so if you're taking that definition, which is some restated way of how you also define intelligence, it would seem that for corvids, they do have intelligence at one level. It does not appear to be just a well-adaptive behavior. They are figuring out, they're getting to a problem, and they're trying to figure out solutions to it in the moment with the program or system that they have in their very small but densely compact brains, which is remarkable, which is absolutely remarkable.
No, and they really are quite remarkable in what they can figure out. And I think one of my favorite stories with corvids is giving them the Aesop's fable of the story of I think it was a raven in the story,
that sounds right,
who can't reach water in a jug and drops stones into the jug to raise the level of the water until he can reach it. And almost as a joke, one of the labs that works with New Caledonian Crows said, well, this bit of folklore exists about them. Wouldn't it be funny to have a look at it? I don't know if that's what was going through their head, but it's a very cute thing to make the animals do. And sure enough, they did it. And they dropped the stones into the water. And it's not ethical to parch a bird of thirst for days on end. So they floated a little tray of food at the top of the water that they couldn't reach without raising the level of the water, which is actually even a bit more complicated physical understanding for the bird to undertake. And they, sure enough, got the stones, dropped them into the graduated cylinder, raised up the level of the water, and got the food. And they also knew to avoid bits of styrofoam that were going to float. They gave them some tricky ones, and they got it right pretty much every time.
Yeah, it's interesting. And people that continue to study ravens or crows is, we keep finding out different things about them. And it's interesting with the parallels between us or other animals that have some aspect of intelligence. I want to ask you about the kind of social elements, and it's kind of in the middle part of the book, some of the social features of birds. You discuss that there are two groups of birds. So I want to make sure I get this right. What are the two groups? And is one of these the passerines? Is this correct? Or is that something separate?
I'm trying to think of which two groups you're talking about. So the passerines are the largest group of birds. They are what we think of as the songbirds, and that's after you sort of peel off a bunch of other specific groups, the sort of the seabirds, the cranes and the rails, and the falcons and other sort of raptor birds. So you keep excluding these specific groups. And then the last one is that you exclude the parrots, and then what you're left with is this huge group of relatively closely related birds that are called the passerines, sometimes called the songbirds or the perching birds. And they're over half of all species, but they're all quite closely related. And they're the sort of crown group that obviously is very highly adaptable because they've diverged into so many different species.
Well, when we have all of these different, as you're describing, these different ways of understanding groups of birds, why, I guess, is this important, and how does that help us understand, I guess, their taxonomy of what they can and cannot do, right, in terms of their I shouldn't say can and can't do, but what are some of the features for some groups of birds as opposed to others in terms of how they're clustered in terms of behavior or sociality or things like that?
So, I mean, in those groups, it's sort of the opposite of what we were talking about at the beginning, of the distinction between humans and birds or mammals and birds as groups. Within these subgroups that we're talking about, we can rely on the fact that they're in the same group, meaning that their evolutionary history has caused them to be similar. So with all of those groups that we peeled off, for example, when the cranes and other sort of stork-like birds diverged, they will have diverged as a common ancestor and then diversified into a group of birds that all have some similarities, sort of long-legged, water-adjacent hunting birds. A lot of them look quite similar. They have similar body morphology. They have similar behaviors. And that's because they all diverged from one original ancestor that diverged with those features and is different from birds precisely because of those features. Parrots will have diverged as a common ancestor and then diversified into all of the different parrots. But all different parrots have some things in common that they share because they're parrots, because they all got them from that same ancestor. And the same is true of songbirds. So within these groups, the similarities are often something that was universal when they diverged, and so they've all inherited it. It isn't the result of a selection pressure pushing different animals to the same solution.
I see, yeah. And so you talk about the altricial birds, is this correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Altricial and nidificus, or sometimes sometimes called precocial.
Yeah. So what are these distinctions, and why are they? What are some of the advantages and key features of these two types?
So the nidificus birds are the ones like ducks or chickens or geese, which lay eggs and sit on them, and then the eggs hatch, and the young take a couple of hours to sort of dry off and fluff up, and then can walk around. They follow their mother. They're sort of a little clumsy version of the adults, and they can get their own food, and they can even swim, even within the first couple of days of life, in the case of the water birds. And we're very familiar with that from sort of the farmyard experience, or maybe if you had a classroom that hatched chicken eggs or something like that. They're pretty capable from pretty young. They're delicate, and they need to be near their mother. And in some cases, they need the warmth of their mother, and they'll huddle under her and things like that. But they can feed themselves. They can walk around. They're sort of muscularly developed enough to partly look after themselves, basically from day one. The altricial birds are quite the opposite. So they're what we think of if you've ever seen a downed nest or found a baby bird that's fallen out of the nest and is in real peril. They're pink. They don't really have any feathers. They've got bulgy, closed eyes, and they can't even hold their head up yet. They hatch out very, very underdeveloped by comparison to the nidificus birds, and they need to be looked after by their parents, sat on for warmth even after they're out of the egg. They need to be sort of force-fed, pre-digested food by their parents. They're a very different model of growing up. So the nidificus birds are hatched out more developed than the altricial birds. And what's interesting about that is it's the altricial birds that go on to be the more intelligent species.
Interesting.
The nidificus birds that are basically ready to go at day one are things like ducks and chickens and geese and that, and they're not unintelligent animals. As the whole animal kingdom goes, they're still really very intelligent animals. But it's on the altricial side where we get parrots and songbirds and the really the humans with feathers. Right.
Yeah. So with songbirds, let's say, you talk about in the book the vocal communication and how their vocal communication is with structure and their ability is similar in some ways to humans. How do you mean that in terms of the structure and the ability, right? So that you have these abilities of vocal communication, that they're doing something. It's not just random gibberish. They're not just, that there's a certain type of structure and then the capacity that they can do it in terms of communicating. So what can we know about how they're able to complete this or to do this?
Sure. So the songbirds are one of three groups of birds that do have vocal learning, and that's different from auditory learning. So we all know that our dogs have auditory learning. You can teach your dog to understand what you're saying and respond to it. Teach them to sit, teach them to shake hands, teach them to roll over and play dead. Right. But none of them ever look back up at you and say, "No, you roll over." In English, they don't learn to reproduce the sounds that you are making when you talk to them. These three groups of birds, are the songbirds, the parrots, and somewhat curiously the hummingbirds, have this ability to hear a sound and learn to produce that sound and make that sound themselves. In addition to recognizing it, obviously you need to be able to recognize it.
So there's a receptive and an expressive component to the way they're communicating.
Exactly. And that sort of vocal learning is really very rare. evolutionarily. Now, it's common in quite a lot of species of birds precisely because the songbirds are so many species of birds. They evolved with this ability and then diversified into a huge number of very successful species. So on average, your average bird is a vocal learner because more than half of birds are vocal learners, but it's only 3 evolutionary groups out of all of the different groups of birds that have this ability in common. And there are only about 4 groups of mammals that have it. Very small groups in the case of mammals, things like whales, primates, obviously, and I think I don't want to forget exactly what it was, but I think it's whales, elephants, humans, and maybe dugongs or pinnipeds, seals and that sort of thing. There's relatively small and specific groups of mammals, and then 2 very small and specific groups of birds, and then the songbirds, which is this huge crowd. So it's a rare ability from an evolutionary perspective. And what it means is that their sound communication is learned. So rather than like a dog having a bark that is the sound that the species makes, they don't come into the world, hatch out already knowing their native tongue, shall we call it. They have to learn it from their parents. And much like us, they learn the same type of speech, shall we? I'm very hesitant to call anything the birds do language, because our language is far and away more complicated. But they learn the language of their parents. So, if you're a chickadee and you hatch out and you hear a chickadee call, you then learn to make the sounds of a chickadee. But it is learned, and it's handed from generation to generation, and we can see shifts over time, just as we do in human language, and we can see regional differences just as we do in human language. So the fact that it is being learned from a parent rather than an inbuilt genetic thing means that within generations and across generations, it can shift and move and change a bit. Changes much more slowly than human language, partly because vocal communication in songbirds especially is deeply connected to their reproduction. So if you get it wrong and you change it too much, you freeze yourself out of the mating market because your potential mates don't hear you, don't understand you, and you don't reproduce. So it can't shift as much as human slang because it's so intimately tied to getting it right in order to attract a mate. But we do see these changes happening. In parrots, they have the ability to learn vocally throughout their life. So and this is one of the things that makes them attractive pets. They can hear sounds all the way up to a ripe old age in the many dozens of years old, and learn to say them back to you, whether they're swears, whether they are embarrassing. There are lots of stories, and I think it's a common trope in Sunday morning comics to have someone lying dead on the floor and the police come in and the parrot says, "I'll shoot him, I'll shoot him." We know that parrots talk.
Right.
With songbirds, it's a little bit more complex, and in some sense, it looks a little bit more like human language learning, in that they have a period when they're young where they are really plastic, as in they have a really flexible ability to learn sounds. And then as they grow older, they lose that plasticity, and their ability to make sounds sort of freezes into what they've already learned. Anyone who's tried to learn a second language as an adult knows that we learn languages much more easily when we're little children. Right. Our vocal learning is more like parrots. It stays throughout our life. We can learn to make new sounds throughout our life. But we do have that critical period where we learn sounds and language better. And this is something that we do share with most songbirds, in that they have this critical period where most of their sound learning is happening, and then they rely on what they learn in that period for the rest of their life in order to communicate with other members of their species. One of the interesting things that's a bit of a difference in how they learn is that when we are babies, we learn by hearing and attempting to imitate in the moment. So particularly, I have 2 young daughters, one's 3 and one is 1. So the 3-year-old has just sort of gone through a big period of language learning and is now a very competent English speaker. The 1-year-old is just babbling, and we're thinking she might pull a mama or a dada on us in the next month.
That's right.
But they practice their sounds as they learn, and they say words wrong. My 3-year-old used to not be able to say frontal S's, so she would talk about going to school and eating her soup with a spoon, and she'd drop the S at the beginning. But they work through it and they improve it. With songbirds, because they're altricial, they spend a huge amount of time with their parents while they're stuck in the nest, and when they still have a little faint, tweety, begging voice and don't yet have their adult voice. And then by the end of about a year, they're able to strike out on their own, and their parents have gone off and are thinking about producing another nest full of babies at that point. So when they're an adult and can actually make the sounds, they're no longer around their parents. So what they do instead is they're very receptive during their time in the nest, and they don't do much imitation at all, but they just hear all of the sounds that their mother and father are making. And then once their voice changes, once their voice breaks and they start to sound more like an adult bird, they start to try to imitate their memory of, if it's a male, their father. And they often get it wrong at first. And they will self-correct it because they can tell that it doesn't match their memory of their father's sound. But they have to do the trial and error of being able to make that sound right as against a memory, because their father has moved on to try to sire another nest in the subsequent year. They don't stay with their parents for years of growing up time when they could learn and do a back and forth of learning those sounds from their father. So part of the reason they have that critical period is to overcome this problem that they're not going to spend a long period of time in their first several years with an adult voice able to try to imitate their parent.
Yeah, and that way it is. I mean, I'm sure listeners will be able to recognize that is very similar to at least the process of the learning of what it is, like for humans. There's that period where, there is a kind of instinctual thing to try and get to language, especially expressive language, but it's tough. It's really, really tough when, you're 18 months, 2 years old, and you're trying to figure it all out. And then, you get to over that hump, and then you start learning different words, and then you start putting phrases and then sentences, and then, it's trial and error.
Yeah, exactly.
It's very, very fascinating. I guess the question here is that how do you have this idea of, I mean, we hear it, this is a difficult question to ask. We hear it as like a song, but this for certain birds, there's complexities and variation in song, right? So it's maybe a way of speaking. Maybe is it something also in terms of like a, obviously it's a learned skill, but is it a language as well? Like it's a way of communicating. Like what are the differences of it? It's not just all this one dimensional way of interacting, right? It seems as if there's something for mating or for breeding, et cetera. How can we understand some of the complexities with their ways of communicating?
Sure. So I don't want to go too off-piste here because bird song is a very studied area, and it is not my area. And there are lots and lots of people who will be very frustrated with me if I try to explain bird song from my non-expert perspective. Okay. It's very complicated. There are no on averages in bird song world.
Everyone's fighting about what it is.
Well, there's a lot of different types of birds that sing, and a lot of different things that they sing for. So it's true that some birds are singing mainly to attract a mate. Other birds are using it to communicate with conspecifics in the area. Some birds are using it to warn people, other birds away. Most things that you can imagine an animal would want to communicate, there is at least one bird that is making a sound in order to communicate that. And for many species, they will use different sounds to communicate different things. In parrots, we certainly see this. They have different sounds for interacting with a mate as they do from screaming at a human to go away from them or something like that. So they also have complexity in what they're using sound for. But it really varies across species, and it's nothing like as complicated as what humans do with our language. I have no reason to think that they're doing things like expressing conditionals in there. If you come over here, then I will. I don't think they're getting into that level of complexity of their communication. But they certainly have a wide range of things that they can communicate with their sound. And they are a very vocal group of animals. That they make a lot of noise, and they make a lot of noise to communicate with conspecifics and with non-specifics, and that's really particularly for those very vocal groups of birds, it's a big part of their interaction with the world.
Yeah, I think what we can say is that it's not necessarily language or song, but it is communication. They are communicating.
Yes,
that's fair to say.
Absolutely, and definitely communication.
Yeah. So kind of towards the end of your book, you talk about, you really kind of drive home, well, you really focus on parrots, and I think it's the last chapter or two of it, and how parrots are similar to humans in various ways. Is this just a piece of convergent evolution? But how are the cockatoos and the gray parrots and the macaws? How is this group the humans of parrots? How do we understand these birds?
So, particularly the macaws and the cockatoos, and I also put the gray parrots in there as particularly specialized groups of parrots, one on each of the continents so that parrots live on, as being really something special in the bird world and in the animal world. These are large parrots, so they have the advantage of having physically more space for a brain. They're very long-lived parrots, so that comes with all of the advantages towards intelligence and things like that. And they are sort of an extreme example of what it is to be a bird. They live longer than other birds. Cockatoo is the record-holding bird for longevity at 83 in the Chicago Zoo. That was Major Mitchell's cockatoo. Wow. And we think many parrots of this size have lived much longer than that. Because he was a zoo specimen, he had all of his documents in a row in a way that pet birds don't. Right. But there's lots of evidence that suggests that there have been pet birds that have easily gotten to 100. Wow. So everything about them pushes to be sort of extreme. They have the biggest brains amongst parrots, which are already the biggest brained group of birds. They have the longest lives amongst the longest living group of birds. They are monogamous. They share our sort of family overwhelmingly. They share our sort of family structure. Is it a life? The most complicated. Sorry,
is it a lifelong mate, or are they kind of like other animals that are kind of serial monogamous, right? Where they have multiple partners, or they kind of keep one partner and then that's it for the 40, 50 years, or is it mixed?
Most parrots will have one lifelong mate.
Wow.
Obviously, there are cases of one partner dying and being replaced. And there are cases of divorce, even among swans, which are famously, they're not parrots, but they're famously a monogamous bird. There are cases of swan divorces where the partners split and find someone new. But particularly with parrots outside of New Zealand, where the New Zealand parrots, which are an outgroup of parrots and evolutionarily a bit different, most parrots, with a few exceptions, are monogamous and do mate for life.
Wow, that's super interesting. And again, I'll just ask this. I mean, you're making the connection here in the chapter, but I mean, I have other scientists as well recognize this as well. Like, hey, parrots are doing this, and this is not exactly how humans do it, but there are some similarities. You're talking about longevity, monogamy, obviously their intelligence. They can have some aspect of learning language of sorts, of human language. Has anyone else picked up on this? How does this kind of received and how people see the kind of sort of comparisons with humans?
So in zoology departments, and when I've spoken to others about this, any one of these individual things are things that get talked about from time to time. And I sort of the very kernel of the idea for this book came from a conversation I had with my doctoral supervisor about why there seemed to be a disproportionate number of people studying birds in biology departments. It's very common for particularly people studying behavior to study birds. And you'd think that as mammals, we would be more focused on mammals. And there's lots of people studying mammals as well. There's lots of labs that use rats and mice and things like that, and chimps and rhesus monkeys. But even given all of that, it does seem like there's quite a lot of people studying birds. Part of that is historical. Konrad Lorenz and Nico Tinbergen sort of founded the field, and Lorenz famously worked with geese, and that was sort of where he got his start. But it's also a case of practical convenience, which is going all the way back to the beginning of our conversation. Most birds are diurnal and most small lab-sized mammals are not. So if you're going to work with, if you can answer your question in any species, you may as well use one that means you can work in the light and don't have to either keep the lab on a flipped day-night cycle or be waking up in the middle of the night to do your work. And my supervisor pointed this out to me. He said, birds are easy to work with. They are pretty robust. They're not as fearful of us as mammals. It goes back to the point I made about pigeons in cities, and they're awake during the day. So if you have your choice, and it doesn't matter what model species you're using, it can often be quite convenient to use a bird. And they're around. They're doing well. So certainly some of those similarities are noticed. I think part of what I'm trying to do here that I hadn't seen done before is drawing them all together and also making the point of how they interlock. So yes, we and birds live a long time because we are K-selected and other animals are selected. But why did these two groups of animals that look so very different both end up strongly K-selected? Why did we both end up monogamous even though most mammals are not? Why do we have biparental care of our children even though most mammals leave it only to the female? Why are birds so intelligent, emerging out of a group of reptiles and dinosaurs that are again intelligent as animals as a whole go, but we don't think of them as on the same level as primates, and that all of these things feed off of each other. And I think that what I think is my original idea here is making the point that these aren't cases of humans and birds coincidentally ending up with 5 different things that they have in common. It's that if you really pursue one of these things to its extreme, and humans are an extreme animal, no other animals living in cities. Sure. Birds are an extreme animal. They're flying and living a long time and have huge brains, or very powerful brains, I should say. If you pursue any one of these things to its extreme, it sort of bootstraps the others along with it. If you're going to live a very long time, you're going to need to be intelligent. If you're going to be intelligent, you're going to need a long childhood in order to build up your brain size and your experience of the world. If you're going to need a long childhood, you're going to need to have 2 parents looking after the offspring to make that work. If you're going to have 2 parents to look after the offspring, you're going to need to be monogamous, or it's not going to make sense for the male to stick around and do that. And so on and so forth. And so any one of these things, my argument is that it necessarily pulls the others along with it. So as I say, we started off with different focuses. Birds took flight, we took big brains. And then those 2 pursuits of an extreme way of life have dragged along all of this other behavioral equipment to support it and made us look very similar.
Yeah, so it's very nice the way you put it. I wanted to just kind of get a little bit of the details of some of that on parrots. So we've talked about this stuff already throughout the conversation, but just on for parrots, what makes it distinct. So we talked about communication, but obviously people, as you've mentioned, that have parrots as pets, and they will learn language, and you make that case that it's, if I understand it correctly, that they learn it's not just simply mimicking or imitating. So how does
a lot of it probably is imitating. So parrots anywhere will pick up the sounds that they hear. They do that in the wild. We see them imitating sounds they might hear in the wild, and it leads to some funny things, like basically wild living parrots having an English word or two, because if they live near a human settlement or something, they'll pick one up, or they'll in Australia they'll hear the loggers or something saying "piss off," and then you'll be in the bush and "piss off" from a cockatoo.
That's funny.
So they do imitate, and that's part of their social behavior, is building up a suite of sounds that they can use in their interactions for different reasons that come from imitation. But we have an animal that's this intelligent. We have an animal that vocally learns. We have an animal that can learn consequences in other environments. So we have tool use experiments with parrots, and we have lock opening experiments with parrots, and all sorts of experiments that don't rely on language with parrots. And they very clearly learn consequential reasoning, as in A leads to B leads to C. There's no reason why they can't learn that A is me making this sound, leads to B is the human doing this thing, which is learning that this has meaning that leads to this. How that's very different from understanding what the word means, as opposed to learning its meaningful consequences, I don't see that as being hugely different. Our words are all about learning that making a sound leads to a consequence, which is having something be understood. We are layering complexity on top of that, so that we can talk about metaphorical things like the state or terrorism, or all of those is that if I say one of those words, it has the consequence of bringing certain very complicated ideas into your head that I want you to be thinking about. The parrot does this in a much more simple way. In Irene Pepperberg's lab with Alex, the African gray parrot, he was learning to say "want nut" means "I get a nut," which means he was expressing that he wanted a nut. He doesn't know that it's English, but he knows what it's doing and that it's accomplishing, putting meaning into the human's head that he wants that human to have.
Yeah. I mean, that's what's remarkable. And again, it goes to your point. You couldn't be able to do that if you didn't have certain characteristics or certain properties of a brain, right? You need some of these parts.
You need that intelligence.
Yeah. I guess just one quick question I have before my last one is you mentioned briefly at the last chapter about them dancing, right? Parrots dancing. What motivates them to dance? Is it a functional thing, or is it a recreational thing, or what can we know?
This remains unclear. An animal dance is somewhat controversial. And Snowball the cockatoo was the first study that showed an animal moving to music was doing so in a way that was statistically in rhythm. It wasn't very good. His rhythm was pretty bad, but it was better than chance. He was on beat more often than you would expect if he was just moving around. Why they do it is unclear, but the same extends to a lot of animal behaviors that we see. So there's a somewhat famous video of a Russian crow using a yogurt lid or some other, some plastic disc to repeatedly slide down a snowy roof, and then he'd pick it up and he'd fly it back up to the top and set it down and stand it up and slide down. And he looks like he's sledding.
Right.
There's no adaptive behavior. There are no yogurt lids in the pre-human natural environment of the Russian crow. This isn't a natural behavior.
Right.
And why they're doing it, biologists get a little bit cagey about trying to read feeling into the animals that we can't possibly know, but it looks like fun, and it looks like the crow's enjoying it, and you might be given with a killjoy explanation, which is that the crow is investigating it to learn about his environment and build up its survival skills, which is what play is in humans. We talk about our children playing so that they learn how to deal with the world.
It's a cognitive capacity.
Whether the crow is getting pleasure from it or not is sort of irrelevant to the fact that it is play in the sense of learning about the environment and developing understanding of the environment. With the dancing, whether it could be related to something to do with their mating. So if there is some rhythmic element to a mating ritual, in some groups of birds, that then could be sort of co-opted if there's rhythmic sounds happening, that they have an urge to move along with them. We're not entirely sure. And I can't say that I know whether Goffin's cockatoos have a rhythmic element to their mating behavior. If they do, that might explain why Snowball the cockatoo was interested in dancing along to pop music. But what we do know is that very, very few animals achieve any kind of statistical rhythm to music. Many animals will move in the presence of music because it's noise and it's stimulating, but getting on beat is extremely uncommon.
This is super, super interesting about what they could be up to, which is again hard to know. The last question I have is how can parrots, and to a large extent birds, and humans best interact with each other on an ever-changing planet? The planet is ever evolving for sometimes good and bad reasons, if you want to say that. And what are whether it's conservation or whether it's just coexisting together, or you name it, how can parrots and birds cohabitate the planet with humans in a productive and friendly way?
Well, the good news is that birds, being highly adaptable, are doing pretty well around us for the most part. There are some birds that are doing very poorly. And it's not surprising that the birds that are more generalists, that can eat a diverse range of things, that can breed pretty much anywhere, that can live pretty much anywhere, like us, we are generalists, and we are turning it into a generalist's world. So birds like pigeons and seagulls and ringneck parakeets and those that find it really easy to live in our cities and our parks and our botanical gardens are doing very well and finding new environments that they can live in. There are parrots living in London now that were presumably either pet releases or something like that, but you can see ringneck parrots in gardens in London living in flocks. So some of them are doing very well. On the other hand, there are some birds that are doing extremely poorly because they're not generalists in the same way. They have a highly specific way of life. There's a species of parrot that migrates between Tasmania and mainland Australia every year to reproduce. And they're doing very poorly because changes to climate and human interaction is making it harder and harder for them to make that journey, and they won't breed unless they make that migration. So we're interrupting this very specific set of environmental circumstances that supports their way of life, and that's causing a problem for them. I think in terms of how we should interact, my hope is that in understanding some of the similarities, we can put a greater element of respect for birds in general into the minds of humans, and seeing so much of ourselves in them. Parrots in particular, and to a lesser extent corvids, I really think of as evolution's other try at an animal that looks something like us from a different lineage. So we are this very unusual confluence of factors that has led to a highly intelligent, highly organized type of animal. Parrots didn't quite get there in the same way. You know, they live a much more simple and wild life than we do, but they share so much with us that it's almost like an offshoot that didn't quite get there. And you wonder if things had been a bit different, if mammals hadn't emerged, maybe you would have seen technological species developing from the parrots, not from the current ones, just as it doesn't happen in current chimps. A particular confluence of evolutionary environments has to make that happen. But they got so close, and in seeing how much of ourselves we see in them, and how much all of these different things that we share go together and are part of one evolutionary movement towards being a certain kind of extreme, intelligent, long-lived, community-oriented, learning animal. We need to treat that with great respect and think about what it is that we are upsetting with development or with other behaviors that affect the environment around us. We're not just moving twittering little birds that can go fly off to another tree. You might be putting out of home a bird that's been living there for 85 years and a highly intelligent organism that has had its whole life in some environment. So there's a sort of a soft conservation element to it there. But mainly what I want to see out of this is just more understanding of evolution, more understanding of how we came to be how we are, and more understanding of how much we have in common with this very distantly related group of animals.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely great words of wisdom that I think all of us should definitely heed. The book is called The Parrot in the Mirror. Yes. It is absolutely fantastic. Where can people find the book, and where can they find you and all your research?
So it's published by Oxford University Press. And the UK release is the 10th of March, 2022. And the Australian and American release is, I believe, the 2nd of June, 2022. It is currently pre-orderable on Amazon in all three of those countries, and presumably anywhere else that will get your Prime shipping around. And I've always wanted to say this, fine bookstores everywhere.
Yes, that's great. Antone, it's such a joy to talk with you.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I really appreciate you coming on and continuing to illuminate many things about the natural world, and whether it has implications for humans or doesn't. It's almost irrelevant in some sense, and then relevant in another way. It's, I think, really important to understand many of the animals and the natural world. And so you're done such a great job with the book, and I can't say enough thanks.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yes. All right. Thank you.